Welcome, everyone. I think we can start. This is our third session of a special seminar series that the EGPP is organizing together with other programs at the Robert Schuman Center on the impact of the war in Ukraine on Europe, on European integration, on European politics in general. And this is the third of 7 sessions that take place weekly on Wednesday, always at the same time. So I introduced the series on our first meeting. I'm not going to do it again. I'm just going to introduce today's sessions, which is on the politics and European politics and European identity. It deals with the impact on cleavages, on populism, on the strengthening of the mainstream, on the core, the weakening of Euroscepticism. So the impact on at the mass level, at the level of citizens, more than at the level of policies, as we had in the first 2 sessions on monetary policy and on energy. The session today is introduced by a larger group of speakers. We have Lisbeth Huge, Gary Marks, Hans-Peter Krisi, Alexandru Mose, and Ioana Elena Oana. I think Lisbeth and Gary are going first. If you like to share slides, I think if it's not already done, please go ahead. And after, that's So in the meantime, I just remind everyone that we have a hybrid seminar, and after the input presentations, we'll alternate questions from the room and online. If you speak from the room, remember to switch on your microphone, otherwise online they cannot hear you. And the goal is really to have a discussion. It's not really a Q&A with questions, but really a discussion that can also take place between those who are attending, not just addressing those who give the input presentations. And in the first session, we had this worked very well because we had many people in the room, so this should be possible also today.
But yes, you can just go to the view, full page view. Go to the view button up in the 3rd tab at the top. View.
Yeah.
No, full screen mode. Full screen mode. 3rd from the bottom. It's visible.
Okay, so we can start.
All right, well, thank you very much, Daniele, for introducing us and also for setting up this very interesting series. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's also a pleasure to see in the audience. I mean, I'm pleased that you turned around and said we should make this an open discussion, because I can see in the audience Catherine, Stephanie Dietland, among others, who are real kind of experts on this. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion, which we're going to be pleased to kind of set off alongside Hans-Peter and his colleagues. And I think my point of departure is the very strong sense that we really, that something fundamental has happened from February 24, that this really is a watershed, not just in European security, but in European integration more generally. And it's an interesting and actually kind of meaningful coincidence that this is the very day that there is a referendum in Denmark on overturning the exception, the opt-out, Denmark's 30-year opt-out from EU defense, a referendum that at least in terms of the public opinion, the polls, has a majority, a large number of undecideds, but a majority in favor of indeed overturning that, opt-out. And I remember actually Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, a few days ago, I think it was on Sunday, saying that historic times call for historic decisions. And at the same time, she said, look, we're going to increase our defense spending to 7 billion kroner, which is almost a billion euros, not much compared to Germany's, but in the direction of the 2% goal. And so one really does have the sense that we're dealing with a watershed. And in our terms, geopolitics is back. In a word, geopolitics is back in European integration. And I say back advisedly. Just press the this one perhaps. Oops, it's just delayed. I say back advisedly because the first thing to recognize is that Ukraine is the return, not the introduction of geopolitics to the European Union. The European Union was founded on the effort to tie Germany and France into an overarching framework in the context of the Soviet threat. Even when geopolitics was not, didn't enter directly into negotiations, say over agricultural tariffs, it underpinned the entire venture. And when you read the early histories of European integration, Derek Owens is a good example. He emphasizes the Cold War, the context of the Cold War, the strategic effort to deal with what was called the German problem, and US support for European integration as a counterweight to the Soviet empire. And that's precisely the way that I teach this in Chapel Hill, to discuss in some depth the geopolitical envelope of European integration. But that was then. And as the Cold War became routinized, so European integration became domesticated. It became self-propelled. It became a matter of internal negotiation. It appeared to be exempt from geopolitics, which was precisely the goal of the EU founders. In short, European integration became a case of polity construction in the absence of its strongest force, and that is collective security. And this is the reason, a little bit of kind of mea culpa in a way, this is the reason that theories of European integration, including neofunctionalism, intergovernmentalism, postfunctionalism, and differentiation, bracket geopolitics. Each focus is on some version of the internal dynamics of European integration, bargaining among member states, supranational spillovers and entrepreneurship, domestic political pressures, which I think, I mean, it's fair to say from the standpoint of today, this is untenable. That is, we're going to have to rethink the dynamics, and I would say also the theories of European integration. Geopolitics really matters, and it seems clear that the course of European integration is now intertwined with the security threat arising not only from the Russian invasion, but also in the ever more explicit clash between the United States and China.
So how might one, it still doesn't, kind of sorry about that. Yeah. So how might one begin to theorize the effect of geopolitics on European integration? And the literature we find suggestive is actually one that is pretty central in comparative politics, and it's the one on collective goods provision, which of course has been a core theme in political science since Thomas Hobbes, William Riker, Eleanor Ostrom. There's a broad background, theoretical and intellectual background there. And it begins with the idea that security is a collective good, like goods that are essential for civilized life, like economic exchange, rule of law, insurance against disaster. A collective good in that it's non-rival and non-excludable. That is, that you cannot deplete it when a large or small number of people consume it. And it benefits everyone living in a society, irrespective of whether every individual actually contributes to the production of that good, collective goods, public goods. And what is so characteristic of these types of goods is that there are clear benefits of scale. That is, you tend to enlarge the benefits of these goods as more and more people contribute to the production of them. So the larger the group that produces security, and that's the good we're interested in here, the lower the costs for each person or country, if you want to put it at a higher level of aggregation. And conversely, the more people contribute, the greater their joint capacity to actually provide that good, in this case, security. So that, of course, is the basis of William Riker's fundamental study on the origins of federalism, the classic explanation of federalism, and I quote, pressing need for military strength and diplomatic maneuverability in response to an external threat. So this is, we think, a useful departure to think of what this particular Ukraine war, but Gary also set out some additional external threats that may be facing in this new geopolitics infused world, that to understand this better and connect it with European integration. And security in the Rikerian frame of mind is a powerful inducement for creating overarching governance. He coined the concept of federal bargain to recognize that this is often there is a trade-off there with the desire for self-rule, but also the need, the existential need in this particular case, for collective governance. Now, Riker was mostly looking at the constituent units, the US states, as billiard balls. He wasn't very interested in the internal politics of it. He was interested in the game, the bargaining game between them, but not inside. When we're dealing with European integration, geopolitics, external threat, I don't think we have that luxury. We need to go inside to better understand what the potential fissures are, what the potential bridges might be, both within and across countries. So what we want to do in the few minutes we have remaining is to give you a little flavor of this, showing some data that actually break open that billiard ball and show some of the divisions and rely on some of the work of the people around the table here.
Yeah, so these are country graphs, and what you see from this, these are kind of the, I'd say, really the conventional country graphs of support for a common defense and security policy among EU member states. This is Western Europe, and what you're, I can just put that on.
Coordination problem.
And what you see is very high levels, the blue lines, very high levels of support for CFSP. And among the EU6, above 70%. It would be no surprise that it's lower. Where's it going to be lowest? Well, it's the UK, of course, the former EU member state UK, where it's just around 56%, still positive for the United Kingdom. Between 60 and 70% for the countries that have traditionally, conventionally been independent from NATO, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Austria, very high levels. Okay, so this is like a point of departure. And actually what we're going to say is pretty misleading, because what you have here is an abstract question. So it's not referred to a particular context. And it's also an aggregation precisely looking at the national level without reference to what goes on inside particular countries. Eastern Europe, the Eastern member states, even higher levels, generally around 80%. In all cases, even in some of the lesser, the more kind of skeptical countries, Hungary, for example, above 70%, actually above 70%. Okay, so that's the conventional starting point. There's enormous support. What you're looking at apparently is a permissive consensus. And what we're going to say is, well, it ain't quite as consensual, and it's certainly not as permissive as these country aggregates suggest.
Yeah, so this so-called broad agreement or permissive consensus becomes much more conditional once you ask more specific questions. So this comes from a 2020 survey in the 27 EU member states published as an EU ID policy paper. And the question there is, if there was an international conflict outside of Europe, which of the following options would you most strongly support? And you see the overarching distribution there. Essentially what you have is 30% of EU citizens, 30% only, who would be willing who would find the most compelling form of cooperation as cooperating within the EU framework. You could add to that an additional 16% who would find NATO as the most important, the most desirable common framework. So that's still not a majority for that has as their preferred option an overarching European defense or security framework. That is one way of kind of picking some holes in that apparent permissive consensus. And you can break this down, of course, by country, and you see there's quite a bit of variation there. It depends a bit where you live in two ways, or in what country you live. First, the scale argument is found broadly confirmation in the sense that typically smaller countries are more likely to choose either an EU or a NATO framework, overarching framework, as the most comfortable, most desirable setting for them to cooperate and confront that external threat outside Europe, I remember. But there are some deviations. Malta, Slovakia are pretty high on national response, so you might actually seems to be some isolationism going on there. There's no clear East-West pattern, and I just want to say that because it's often seen, well, you know, the Eastern countries want NATO and the Western countries want the EU. It's not that simple, and I don't have the time to go into detail, but we can if you want. And what is also interesting is there's 7 countries, Slovakia, Latvia, Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, and Italy, where there's no majority for either EU or NATO cooperation, those combined. So this is conflict outside Europe. We now have this interesting, only intellectually interesting challenge of conflict within Europe. That, of course, involves the Ukraine. And this is a question, and Dietlind, this comes from your just stolen shamelessly from your publication using the YouGov poll, which is a specific question, which I think is interesting, on cooperation on handling Russia in the shadow of the war in Ukraine. And it's interesting because it taps what has been presented as the German debate, right? Investing in defense to fend off the security threat, or engaging in trade and diplomacy to diffuse the security threat. You could say using a stick approach or a carrot approach, right? And you see that the don't knows are lowest in Germany these are the gray kind of, this is the gray in the middle, you know, where, which would be consistent with an interpretation that the debate has been most public, lively, engaged in Germany. But cross-nationally, there's 2 things that strike me there. One is there are very different preconceptions about the relative value of the stick. That is, European countries should invest more in defense and security to defend against Russian aggression. And the carrot, that is, that European countries should invest more in trade and diplomacy with Russia across. And so you see the extremes, Poland very much the stick, and Bulgaria very much the carrot. Again, the East-West comparison is a simplification that doesn't work very well. And the second thing I want to point out is the proportion of don't knows and neither varies a lot. And you know, closer look seems to suggest that the more proximate you are, physically proximate to Russia, the less don't knows or in gray there is. There tends to be a connection there with the proximity of the potential physical threats. There we go.
Okay, now let's get to ideology within countries and support for CFSP. And this is a way of getting there. This is using Chapel Hill expert data. On the y-axis, party position on CFSP 2019. On the x-axis, the general left-right position of those political parties. Each circle, I mean, there are almost 200, 193 of them, is a political party with greater than 3% vote in the previous election or the general election of that year. And what you see is this inverted U curve. So it's the mainstream parties that are most in favor of CFSP, the middling parties on general left-right position, and on both extremes, on the left and on the right, there is much less support for CFSP. And it's a clear and powerful pattern. You can see that the R squared, this is the bivariate R squared, and the curve is a fractional polynomial. And what's going on here? Well, the sources of opposition are distinctive on left and right. On the left, it's, I mean, in a single word, you'd say pacifism. On the right, in a single word, you'd say nationalism. So on the left, radical left parties are significantly less inclined to support CFSP than mainstream parties because they're worried about involvement that might lead to a war. And then radical right, we call them tan parties. They're more interested in defense budgets, in investing in military power, often more so than mainstream parties, but they want that to be subservient to expressly national purposes, national sovereignty, and hence they don't like CFSP. That's the direct and shorthand expression of the meaning of that relationship.
So this is the final graph. Governments, of course, are composed of political parties. So this raises the question whether there's any meaningful variation across the party families. Blotting out country for now on support for the same question, CFSP. So this is also CHESS data. 15 years apart, kind of interesting to see whether there's been a shift. So my left, the situation in 2006, and my right, the situation in 2019. There's two shifts over time beyond the U curve, the inverted U curve that Gary pointed out. There's two shifts over time. The one is that the opposition in 2006 was clearly two-sided, and Gary pointed it out. Nationalism for the radical right, and pacifism or anti-Atlanticism as well, connecting with that for the radical left. You see that both radical right extreme on my side on the left, oddly enough, and then radical left, the second from the right, are just the lowest, and the blue bar there is the median position in these box plots. So, and in 2019, by 2019, the opposition and support has changed. First, I mean, the bottom line is that it has received a more Galtan type of flavor, in the sense that you see the sharpest decline in support on the radical right, but also the conservatives. And if you look within it, the more tan conservative parties come out there. And those differences between 2019 and 2006 are actually statistically significant in a two-tailed means test, which is actually not so a pretty tough test to take. And the other thing you see is that on the side of radical left and green, they have held up their support in the face of a general slight decline, overall decline in support for CFSP over time. They've held up their support, or in the case of the radical left, even shorted up somewhat. They're still negative, below 4, but they're clearly not as anti anymore as they were 15 years before. So if you plot this in a simple regression model, then the Galtan position of the parties actually explains all by itself 28% of the variance. So these are just some pictures of kind of breaking open that billiard ball. We don't have a very clear bottom line for you guys, but we hope that helps us think through some of the potential scenarios for Europe and European integration.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisbeth and Gary. We can move to the second. I think you have to change the slides. For those the audience online, we are just trying to put up the second set of slides. Bear with us for a second. Okay. Okay, thank you.
I think it was a very good idea to have Gary and Lisbeth start, because they made a general introduction and they introduced some data which are specifically about the common defense, foreign and defense policy. We will be less specific.
It's working, right?
What? How do you advance?
Just take these buttons up and down, up and down.
Okay.
Okay, and then you just go.
We will speak about the salience of, so we have public opinion data. We continue where Lisbeth and Gary left off. We have data on the salience of crisis. The biggest challenge facing the EU and its member states at the moment of the Ukraine crisis. We have data on the assessment of the performance in crisis, the satisfaction with the way the EU handled the crisis and the evaluation of specific policies. And in the end, because in the title there is EU identity, we also have 2 slides on the EU identity. Our data come from the YouGov survey for the State of the Union on the one hand. Thanks to Dietlind, I got access to this file, which covers 5 years, 2018 to 2022, in up to 17 member states. And then we have 3 surveys from our own research program, SOLID, an ERC program, one in June last year, one in December last year, and one in April this year, covering different countries, but we will focus on 5, the ones we have also included in April of this year. So first, I will talk about the salience of the crises. And I will make a brief argument before I show you the data, which I think is very important. It's the argument that parties can do relatively little with respect to public salience of issues. So the short-term social trends and events like crises determine public issue salience, independently of the political and the media agenda. So the vulnerability of our societies to exogenous shocks determines what the public thinks is salient. This means that public salience drives short-term electoral volatility, and it means that parties have a limited ability to set the agenda and are forced to follow long-term trends and short-term public salience. I mean, the long-term trends, of course, have something to do with the cleavages you mentioned, but in the short run, the long-term trends might be counteracted by something like a crisis. And here is the responses in our April 2022 survey to the question, what is the biggest challenge for the survival of the European Union today? And you see that we provided the options, and we gave examples for each general option. So the war or political instability, for example, the Ukraine crisis, it dominates. A third thinks this is the most important challenge. Financial and economic inequalities between member states, for example, the Eurozone crisis comes as number 2. Non-European refugees, for example, the 2015-16 refugee crisis is number 3. Poverty and unemployment, climate change, exiting member states, for example, Brexit, European refugees from neighboring countries, and then the pandemic. The pandemic is last, for example, COVID pandemic. People, if asked about the most important challenge, seem already to have forgotten COVID to some extent. Now, the same or a very similar question, what is the most important problem facing your country, has been asked in this YouGov survey, and you see here the results are somewhat different. Also, the options are given. Number 1 is rising prices. Number 2 is energy supply, and only number 3 is the war in Ukraine. Number 4 is health, so COVID here is still present. Immigration is still very high, government debt, environment, and then comes unemployment, crime, pension, taxation, housing, education, and terrorism. If we compare the different regions of Europe, Scandinavia, Western, Eastern, and Southern Europe, you see that in all 4 regions, rising prices dominates. In 2 regions, the war is number 2, in Scandinavia and Southern Europe, but in Western and Eastern Europe, energy supply is number 2, and surprisingly to me, the war is much less prominent in Eastern Europe than in the other regions. I mean, that is food for discussion. But you see that in Southern Europe, more than in the other regions, inflation, the rising prices predominates absolutely. Now, thanks to the file of YouGov, we can see the trends over time. There are 3 topics, issues that have a rising trend. It's rising prices, energy supply, and the environment. The environment has a steady increase. The other 2 explode as a result of the situation in April 22. You see there are 2 topics with declining trends. It's immigration and terrorism. Immigration declines at a relatively high level. You see the rising of the 2 top issues, and of environment is the same or is similar across the regions again. Surprisingly, in Southern Europe, rising prices was already an issue before the war. And I don't know exactly why this is the case, because there was no inflation going on even in Southern Europe. You also see that climate change, the environment, is not an issue in Eastern Europe at all, and a very limited issue in Southern Europe. Climate change is something for Scandinavia and Western Europe. But the very abruptly rising trend you see everywhere for rising prices and energy supply. This is my last slide for Salience. You see there are also other patterns. On the left, you see the pattern for unemployment and health. They peaked under COVID and are on rapid decline now. So health and unemployment become much less important compared to rising prices. And you see there are stable trends: housing, taxation, crime, education, pensions are just constant preoccupations that do neither increase nor decrease. What I wanted to say at the end of this part of the presentation, Gary said we are at a watershed, and geopolitics is now becoming the overriding issue. If you see this, it's maybe less geopolitics. People are preoccupied with rising prices and energy supply. That has, of course, something to do with geopolitics. But the most imminent problems are the cost of living problems and the real wages which people experience in everyday life. So now I hand it over to Nena.
Thanks a lot. So I will follow again with some descriptive statistics, again, only on mostly on between countries differences without opening so much the box that you were talking about. I will present data on satisfaction with EU and policy preferences. And there are two main insights I would like to convey. One is looking at this data from the perspective of a hypothesis of crisis as providing an impetus for EU polity building in terms of bonding. So having a strong rally around the flag effect that might provide this impetus for having more bonding and eventually stronger European identities. I'm gonna show you some data on satisfaction with both how governments performed in the crisis and how the EU performed in the crisis. We're gonna see that this is at an all-time high without much country heterogeneity. So it seems that when looking at this diffuse measure, let's say of support and performance evaluations, you cannot see much country heterogeneity, and this rally around the flag is indeed supported. So as you can see here, here is data from June 2021, so during COVID, December 2021, and end of March 2022, after the Ukraine war started. And as you can see here, indeed, satisfaction with the government performance during the crisis is at an all-time high without much differences between these 5 countries in our survey. The trends look pretty much the same across countries. What's more interesting that when moving to the satisfaction with the EU's performance, here is where we notice the biggest differences, because now with the latest crisis in Ukraine, you don't notice so much country differences, but we can see that during COVID, we had a lot more heterogeneity. So we could say that at least with this initial very preliminary descriptive data, this rally around the flag hypothesis is somewhat supported. And it's interesting that this rally around the flag is also around the EU flag, not only around the government's flags. However, going back to Gary's and Lisbeth's insight that when going to more specific policies, it's there where we notice this conflict. I'm gonna now move to some policy preferences. And indeed, it's here that we observed heterogeneity. So while we have constant satisfaction across the board, across these different regions in Europe, policy preferences are actually quite heterogeneous. And we will see the outlier here is Hungary, for which we are still in search of several explanations. We'll put forward several explanations, but would be very happy to discuss with you what might be behind this. And also we will notice a very strong divide between Hungary and Poland, which used to be former allies in the other crisis, kind of like the bad kids around the block, but now we notice the biggest divide between them. So the two policies that we looked at in terms of this device is preference for stopping reliance on Russian energy. And here respondents voiced their preferences for not ending reliance on Russian energy, ending this gradually and ending this immediately. And we can notice here that while there is some country variation following from Germany, Italy, France, and Poland, their attitudes do not vary so much, and they might be explained partly by their different rates of reliance on Russian gas. However, Hungary here appears as an outlier at the end of the spectrum. There's a very small category that would like to end reliance on Russian gas immediately, and a very high proportion who would like to not end it at all. And that's even more surprising in light of the fact that Hungary and Poland actually have similar rates of reliance on Russian gas, around 40%, and they still appear at opposite ends of the spectrum. The next policy is about opinion on Ukraine's EU candidacy and whether this should be pushed through as a member, considered as a candidate in the future, or not be considered a candidate at all. And here as well, we see that in Hungary, more than a third of respondents would not want Ukraine to be considered a candidate, whereas there's a very little ratio of those that think that Ukraine should not be considered a candidate in Poland. Again, this difference between Hungary and Poland is striking in light of several similarities between the countries. So they're both similar in terms of proximity, they're similar in terms of their rates of reliance on Russian gas, they're similar in terms of historical experience with Russia. So perhaps going a bit against and opening the discussion with Hans-Peter, one explanation for this big divide would be that while indeed Salience does not follow party cues, policy preference do follow party cues. And one explanation for Hungary being such an outlier would be the cues they would get from Orban, which voiced himself in quite, let's say, pro-Russian terms. And I will give the floor to Alex now.
Thank you. So I'll briefly talk about policy differences in terms of acceptance of refugees, and then lastly, a bit about European identity. I'll just reemphasize a point that Nena was just finishing on, which is why we're so surprised by this big difference between Poland and Hungary. And particularly when turning to refugee policy, the shared experience that both Poland and Hungary have with Russian aggression is quite interesting, noting the differences in acceptance of refugees, especially thinking of Hungary's experience in 1956, being invaded and then having a mass exodus of refugees. So this shows you the attitudes towards accepting refugees from different conflicts, different countries. And what this basically shows you is that overall, there's a much higher rate of acceptance of refugees from Ukraine compared to refugees from other conflicts. Hungary is still a bit of an outlier, so it has the overall lowest share of acceptance in general of refugees, but also of Ukrainian refugees. However, this question is a 10-point scale, and you can see the red dotted line around the 5, which would be, let's say, neither approving nor disapproving. So even in Hungary, you can interpret this as a majority is still in favor of Ukrainian refugees. However, it's still lower. I won't get too much into interpretation here. We can talk about this in the Q&A. There's probably racial issues determining this divide, but also cultural, historical issues, proximity, and then also the nature of the different types of refugees that you have, that now you have mostly women and children as opposed to men. Again, what I find also very interesting in this graph is in Poland, seeing sort of a large jump. And then in Italy, we have kind of the highest rate of acceptance of all kinds of refugees and the smallest gap between Ukrainian refugees and non-Ukrainian refugees. So here's where some interesting differences start appearing. So here we ask the question of who should be sharing the burden or the responsibility for accepting refugees. In the dark bars are responses to whether these refugees should stay in the country of origin, and in the light bars, whether refugees should be shared among all EU countries. And again, we note the very interesting difference between Poland and Hungary. So in Hungary, you see that both options have a very low rating. So Hungarians, basically, we interpret this as them simply not accepting refugees. So not accepting either burden sharing nor refugees staying in their country of origin. But in Poland, then you see a very interesting reversal compared to 2021. now that Poland is a frontline state, that it's receiving the vast majority of Ukrainian refugees, more than 3 million by this point, you see a reversal. And then now in Poland, they're very much in favor of sharing the burden, sharing refugees among EU countries. What I also find very interesting about this graph is looking at Italy, that before it used to be a frontline state in the 2015 refugee crisis and the waves ever since. And one might have expected that Italy would now reverse, being no longer a frontline state, having taken a lot of the burden of the 2015 crisis. You might expect Italians to say, no, 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 now it's Poland's turn to take this burden. But instead, you still have a high rate of respondents saying that the burden should be shared. So this points to the idea of some sort of policy continuity or some kind of empathy, which is interesting because then this might result into long-term trends in Poland as well. And then again, increasing this divide between Poland and Hungary. Maybe one more note here. Again, we find this Poland-Hungary puzzle to be quite interesting, given the very similar politics that Fidesz and PiS had up until now. So I think that can make for quite an interesting discussion. So lastly, I'll talk a bit about European identity and views on integration. So just as two starting points, and to talk about our expectations before we launched the survey and when designing the questions. So European identity has several different bases: cultural, economic, religious, and so on. But we know that identity is often built in opposition to other groups. I feel Romanian or German or European as opposed to feeling as something else. So this led us to a first hypothesis where we thought that European identity would actually grow stronger in the face of a common enemy, Russia. So we could easily point, we're European, peace-loving, it's part of the core values of the EU, and then we have this aggressor that's antithetical to these values. The second starting point is that European integration through different mechanisms is driven by crises and shared problems. So we would have expected that a desire for EU integration increases in the face of a common military and energy threat. So in terms of European identity, we actually don't find support for the hypothesis. If anything, it seems to be going the other way around. So this shows you the responses to a question where we asked respondents to choose between whether they feel primarily as European, and then of nationality, so European then Romanian, Romanian then European, and nationality only. And what you see is that for some countries, these patterns are stable. So for France and Hungary and Italy, they're mostly stable. However, for Germany and Poland, you actually have decreases in the share of respondents feeling primarily European or primarily European and then nationality. So this seems to go against our hypothesis. And one interpretation for this would be that what happens in the face of a common threat is that you actually pull back to your stronger identity, which generally tends to be the national identity. And you might see this rally around the flag in this sense more to the nation state, particularly then if we think, let's say in Poland, think of the historical experience that Poles have with Russian aggression, then it can make sense that that national identity gets strengthened, even at the cost of European identity. But again, these are not, I would still say that this is rather stable. So I wouldn't say that this is a very strong effect. And overall, I'm not showing the graph for this, but overall in the last 10 years, rates of European identity have actually increased slightly. So the overall trend is positive, but we see sort of a bit of a reversal here. However, we do find support for our second hypothesis. So this is again data from the three waves of our different surveys that we mentioned before. And we see a jump in sort of accepting approval of further European integration. First of all, during COVID, so from June 21 to December 21, but also since then with the war in Ukraine. And again, this to us makes a lot of sense. It's the war in Ukraine is quite explicitly a common threat to the EU, even though some parts of it are asymmetrical. So there are some member states that feel more vulnerable to Russian aggression. And there are some member states that are more dependent on Russian energy than others. So we have some asymmetry, but still it's being framed as a common challenge. So it's not that surprising that we see a jump in views for European integration. But this also suggests that this can be a opportunity for the EU to take hold of this jump in public opinion to push for further integration. And I'll just end by mentioning that we fielded this first survey at the end of March 2021, precisely to capture this kind of rally around the flag effect. And we're going to field a second wave as a panel survey in July. And we're actually quite curious to see whether some of these trends will decrease or whether these effects will remain. And that survey will also focus a lot more on geopolitics with questions. So hopefully we'll have even more answers by then. So I'll stop here and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your insights and data. The floor now is open for discussion. Who would like to kick off? You need to, yes, remember, switch on your microphone and maybe just briefly say your name and affiliation.
Hi there, Stefan Schmidt. I'm a Reconstitution Fellow, visiting fellow at the STG. I just wanted to ask for clarification on whether burden sharing means only distribution of refugees among the EU states, or does it also mean subsidies, transfers from the EU coffers to pay for the hosting of refugees in a given country? And did you try to differentiate in the survey?
Thank you for the question. So in the graph that we showed, this is just distribution of refugees. So should refugees be distributed? But we asked a separate question on whether the EU should financially compensate countries that based on how many refugees they take. So we have data on that as well. They tend to correlate quite highly.
Okay, thank you. Dietlind?
Yes, thanks a lot for these wonderful presentations. I have two questions, I think. First of all, I want to ask all of you actually about the mismatch that you find with regard to EU institution building, where you do find, especially Gary and Lisbeth, a very strong support across European countries, across Eastern European countries. But when it comes to the issue of Ukraine and institution building around there, maybe we should see it more as policies there and not institutions. There is a real different support across. So I think, and this is also becoming obvious in the data that the three of you analyzed as well, that there are differences. So I would like to think this through, why this is the case. I think some of you said it might be the distance to Russia that is really defining the interest there, but might it be also something else? The second question is for something Hans-Peter said about rising prices, and that comes from our EUI YouGov survey, that rising prices take on such an importance. And I was wondering whether you have looked into where this comes from. So who are the people who name rising prices? Are these the ones that are not doing well economically, or are these the ones that are concerned potentially about the Ukraine conflict and energy supply issues there? Does it have an economic dimension, or is it something else? So I was just curious to hear about that, and to understand whether the issue of rising prices is related to Ukraine or not. Thank you.
On this point, maybe Daniel, if it's on this point, or yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for these very broad insights on very interesting indicators. I have two very short questions. One for Gary and Lisbeth, and your framing of these indicators as geopolitics. Are these people who can, change their mind, really thinking in terms of a positive geopolitical frame and they love the West?
Or are these people who don't want to be hostage of geopolitics and say that we want to determine our own way and we need weapons to do that? And that's how they see Europe. I'm thinking in particular of kind of, the countries affected directly by the conflict, but maybe also of a broader population. And my second question is to the second team of authors. And it's maybe not a very constructive kind of, question in light of the data which you have, but can we interpret kind of, reasonably a country where you don't have media freedom and the media are controlled by the government in terms of the public opinion in the same way as you do it for the other countries?
Would you like to respond? Because there are three more speakers.
Shall we wait or shall we respond? I'd be happy to respond, but I'd like to hear the question short.
Yes, respond for now, and then we move on to the next questions.
All right. Let me just kind of frame a short and general response. We're talking about public opinion data, and when we're thinking about that data, using that data, the context is all important. So it doesn't. So to give one example, it doesn't surprise me that when you ask about people, what are you concerned with? Their first response is, what is their family concerned with? Rising prices. That is what affects me as an individual and my family. The question was about the country. Yeah, but when rising prices are there, rising prices could affect the country because it affects the national budget. It increases the pressure on the national bank to. But I don't think individuals are there. I think when you turn around and they say, well, what's your concern with rising prices? They think, hey, my wallet is involved. So I would make a distinction between, so when we're asking these abstract questions, we're often not engaging, we're engaging people's real concerns in orthogonal or very specific ways. So I wouldn't kind of counterpose their concern about inflation to their views on whether Europe should enlarge or whether there should be a greater emphasis on common security policy. And it actually relates to Daniel's question. So what is in, what's in the mind of the respondent when you talk about the Ukraine? And I think, it depends, everything depends on the way that you frame the question. I would think people's main concern potentially is their own vulnerability to attack and the way in which they interpret this. And I think that does relate to distance from Russia in terms of vulnerability. But at the same time, people's perceptions of threat will vary enormously from context to context. And I think that does matter, that does relate, as Hans-Dieter was saying, and others besides, that in terms of the exogenous shock, that may relate to the salience of an issue, but in terms of the position on an issue, the government policy of the parties in power may have a differential impact on that.
On the last point, I would have said exactly the same. Parties and politicians, governments have very little leverage with respect to salience, but with respect to positions, the attitudes, the preferences, they have a lot of leverage. And the Hungarian case is of course special because the cues people receive from the government and from the media are very different from the cues they receive now in Poland. So Poland changed politics, whereas Hungary remained the same, and that explains why the two countries' public opinion react differently, I would say. About the mismatch, Dietlind was asking, I think people are much more ready to agree to European integration if they get abstract questions. If they get more specific questions on specific policies, they are much more differentiated, I would say. And that explains the mismatch. Unfortunately, your second question I cannot answer because there was little time and I just had a first look at the data. But if you want to, we could look together at these questions. I think it would be extremely interesting to study that question.
Okay, thank you. Adrian?
Just add a
yes.
Just a quick point to the Hungarian question. So whether we can interpret it, I would say that I wouldn't have the same concerns that I would have about public opinion in Russia, for example. But I think the interpretation does have to take into account the fact you don't have much independent media left in Hungary. But I wouldn't necessarily doubt that this is public opinion. Then the result is that public opinion in Hungary is formed in a very different way. You don't have such a plurality of voices as you would in other countries. And then just at what Hans-Peter was saying, then just looking at some very simple analysis, in Hungary, political affiliation, so whether you feel close to the government, is one of the strongest predictors for how you feel about Ukraine, refugees, and so on. And in Poland, it's not. It's a more of a valence issue. So this points to the fact, well, much more analysis is needed, but it points to the fact that in Hungary, this became very politicized, specifically by Fidesz and Orban, in a way that you don't have in most other countries, but in particular in Poland, where everyone seems to be kind of agreeing on this.
Thank you. Adrienne?
Yes, I would like to go back to the question raised at the very beginning when Gary said integration theory needs to be reconsidered in view of geopolitical factors. And I would like to invite you to maybe to spell out more a theoretical argument. What exactly would be the kind of the causal steps in your argument? And surely it would also include what we have been discussing right now. How are political elites and party leaders reacting to saliency of these different issues linked to this threat? And how does the outcome then vary, in terms of the attitude towards integration?
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Marius Gincha, PhD researcher, SPS, third year. So I have two questions for Gary and Lisbeth, and two questions, or one comment and a question for Alex, Mona, and Hans-Peter Christie. So let's start with the first presentation. Here I have a question about the way you see security and security policy. You are talking about security in terms of public good. And I'm not sure that security in the way you talk about in the way of European integration is a public good. I would see it more like a club good, in which it is you basically it's not available to everyone. You get into the club. So does it have an implication when security is taken into account to understand European integration, if it's a public good or if it's a club good? Because if it's a club good, then European integration basically gives you access to club goods. And the second point is related to geopolitics and the implication of geopolitics, the earlier discussion. I actually, is there a difference? Because individuals at the micro level, everyday Joe, may perceive like price increases as the most salient issue, but we can still say that at the macro level, at the national level, among the elites, geopolitics is the key issue. So even if when I'm going to the store, I'm more interested in inflation, elites who need to think in macro terms may very well think that the geopolitical tension is the key issue, not necessarily the inflation. The inflation is just a side effect, an outproduct of the geopolitical dimension. And the second point, the second set of questions is related to the effect of public opinion, especially in Hungary. Here, I think what we have is a kind of natural experiment, which can contribute more or less to the literature in foreign policy analysis on the effect of public opinion on foreign policy and backwards. There's an old debate: does public opinion influence foreign policy, or do elites give cues and form public opinion? And what you find is basically that, at least in the case of Hungary, the elites give the cues to the public, and that goes against the entirety of the literature I know in the last 5 years on this topic, which shows the opposite. Basically, that literature is mostly based on experiments, experimental evidence, but what it shows is the opposite, that decision makers take into account public opinion and follow public opinion. What you show, at least in the case of Hungary, is that the opposite is the case. And this is kind of a natural experiment, looking also at the different cases in other countries. And the last point related to European identity, and I'm working on identity and foreign policy. And the question which I have now is, okay, this crisis in Eastern Europe didn't increase the salience of European identity as a categorical change in which you transition from seeing your national identity as primary to seeing your European identity as primary, but you have slightly the opposite effect. But a more interesting question, at least in the literature I'm conversing with, is like, is there a change in the content of the national identity? People may identify primarily as Hungarians, as Polish, or as Germans, but what they mean by Germanness may very well be in terms more akin to Europeanness than necessarily just having a shift in categorical identity, but more like in the content of their national identity and so on. So there are different types of changes which are measured differently. It would be interesting if you have a way to uncover that, if different types of changes, not only in categorical change, but content change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I just remind that we have the actual session on defense policy and security next week. So we should really focus on mass politics, identity. So also in the responses, I would invite you to focus on this. But before you do, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for these great presentations. I just have a few questions, and it feeds off what Adrienne also asked. In a way, I would like you to speculate a bit more on this event or crisis-driven integration that we might see in terms of what type of crisis actually pushes what kind of integration. You have data on the pandemic, on climate change, which is a much slower moving crisis versus more of a geopolitical crisis. So should we actually observe different kind of attitudes towards more EU integration and or EU or European identity? And then a second question I had, so we talk about the proximity to Russia. I wonder whether the proximity to Ukraine matters as well, in that sense that actually Poland and Ukraine have a very different relationship to one another, the populations, the language, etc., than Hungary and Ukraine have. So shouldn't we also look into proximity to not only the aggressor, but the country that has been attacked? And thirdly, I'm wondering, so the Eurobarometer had separate questions on foreign policy and security policy until 2004, and then merged these. And I'm just wondering, when you, especially for you, Gary and Lisbeth, in terms of the Chapel Hill expert survey, do you look at both policy domains together or separate? Because people actually happen to evaluate foreign policy and foreign, like in the name of foreign policy, differently than in the name of security, where military hardware is very expensive, etc. So, I mean, various different preferences move in when security is added to foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay, please, the floor is back to you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick on this. These are all great questions. I'll start with the last one first. Common foreign and security policy. That's the question in chess, and that's, you know, for typical of a panel data, we've kept this constant the first time 2006, and then 2002, and then last time in 2019. I'm actually very doubtful that our party experts make a clear distinction between common foreign and security policy and a common defense and security policy. So I'm not sure. I'm guessing, right? I just cannot give you a straight kind of, yeah, we've tested this and so forth, but I'm pretty much confident that what they focus on is the external dimension, barring trade, because that has a different question, the external dimension of the EU. But it's a good question, and we cannot unpack it. In terms of security as a public good or a club good, that's a really good comment. And I think using the word public good, which I slipped once, was somewhat imprecise. I think it is better to conceive of security as a club good, but once you're inside a club, it takes on the properties of a public good, right? For those, but what is the difference, the critical difference between a club good and a public good, a pure public good, is that when it is a club good, the boundaries of the club have to be set. And so in this particular case, the boundaries of the club can be contested, as we see, for example, around Ukraine membership, yes or no, and so forth. And I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind as we're talking about security in the context of European Union. And then final quick point on Adrian, the quick answer is in progress. What we seem to be mostly a constant over the past 60 years or so, or maybe 70 years, has become a parameter that changes values. And so we have to it's clear what we need to do. We need to incorporate that in our theories. And I guess what I would say, the minimum it does, it infuses an element of uncertainty and risk. And these are different concepts, as you're very well aware of. So uncertainty and risk in understanding the dynamics of European decision-making and the dynamics of public opinion formation. We as post-functionalists, we can still use those lenses that we have to try to understand how that affects party dynamics and how that affects public opinion dynamics, elite versus public opinion cues and so forth. But how precisely that is going to be infused, this is something that we need to think through. And I think it's going to be a work in progress with no particular end date.
Can I say a word to that too? I agree with Lisbeth, not surprising perhaps. But I'll give you a simple answer, and then one has to take into account the complexities. The simple answer is this: that if you think of the process of European integration, which has such clear functional benefits in terms of creating the market and all of the policies alongside those, where there are benefits of scale, where they are, you could think collective goods or club goods, which, as Elizabeth says, have the character of public goods once they are encompassed. That those benefits, those functional pressures have vastly increased. They've vastly increased in a way that brings us closer to Chuck Tilley. I mean, the literature on state building is essentially, well, as Chuck Tilley put it, wars make states and states make war. Which doesn't mean to say that the contestation within countries is going to be ameliorated. So there's still going to be contestation within countries. And what I showed, and particularly Elizabeth showed there, was that contestation has a very clearly articulated ideological character. So if you ask me what the bottom line would be, I'd say it opens up the possibility of greater integration, even in the face of contestation. And when people describe post-functionalism, they often get it wrong. They often say, well, this is a theory of disintegration. It is not. It is a theory of a tension between functional pressures and domestic contestation. And I think what we've seen is that those domestic pressures now have a different character. So, and scale, when you think, why do we have countries with so many millions of people? What is going on there? What is the drive for that? And the fundamental drive in that literature, going back to Tilley and to Hobbes, is simply the benefits of cooperation in the provision of invisible goods, that we call them public goods. We want to talk about it in more depth because it's a long story. But thank you both for the question.
My answer to Adrienne is the same as Gary's. That there is a paper by Kellerman and McNamara which says that we should bring in state building theory into integration theory. And in our project, we had a discussion with Kellerman and McNamara, and Kellerman said, there is nothing like a Russian tank concentrating the mind. So he illustrated, I mean, they wrote the paper before the war, but he illustrated the usefulness of their paper facing this crisis. the question, what kind of crisis produces what kind of integration? We try to discuss this in our project, and there is a paper by Federico Ferrara and myself, which says there are two dimensions which are very important here. One is whether the crisis incidence is symmetric or asymmetric, whether all member states are hit in the same way or hit in different ways. And that distinguishes very much between the refugee crisis, where asymmetry was prevailing, and COVID, where arguably everybody, a pandemic hit everybody, some more than others, but still it was a universal pandemic, and led much more to cooperation and solidarity than the refugee crisis. And Magnus, you about inflation being also geopolitical, but it makes a difference whether rising prices are the main problem or whether war is the main problem. For rising prices, you have the ECB. You have an actor in the EU which has competence and which is expected to deal with that problem. Huh? Yeah, but that's the most important part of the EU. But whereas for war, you have NATO, which is not the EU. So the actor responsible for a certain issue may vary, and depending on how you frame the issue or define the issue or see the problem, you expect different types of actors to become active.
If I can add a little bit, so on this, I think the symmetry point is the main dimension of interest, and I think the interesting question here is to what degree is the crisis in Ukraine symmetric? Because on the face of it, it is a bit asymmetric in terms of dependence on energy and threat, but it does have a symmetry in terms of, I'm not sure how to call it, but something like moral outrage. So public opinion in the EU is quite similar, at least as when it comes to the war. When it comes to policies, then as we saw, it's a little bit different. Just to respond quickly to Marius's points, elites, so in Hungary, elites determining public opinion, I think that is quite interesting. And again, the data that I've seen does suggest that this is the case. So I also saw some Hungarian public opinion data right at the beginning of the war. So our survey is a bit later in the third, fourth week. And right at the beginning of the war, you still had a majority, a majority of Hungarians supporting Ukraine, and even a majority of, actually it was a plurality of Fidesz supporters, and there were a lot of don't knows. So Orban in the beginning chose to go against public opinion, and he managed, at least with some success, to modify it. But the fact that he went against public opinion, I think, is quite interesting and something worthy of exploration. And then your point about identity and the sources of it. So we actually, in this survey, we ask a question about the sources of European identity. We haven't looked into that yet, but we can. So does European identity primarily for you represent stability, peace, growth, and so on? But it's an interesting point to check, not whether it increases, but whether the sources change.
Perhaps complementing on the response on Hungary, I think, yeah, it's interesting that this happens, that particles influence public opinion, but I guess the bigger question that we have difficulty answering is within which scope conditions can this happen? Because in line with the question before, this did happen given the curtailment of media freedoms and Orban's stronghold on media and on the Hungarian government, but can it happen elsewhere? That's the still open question.
Okay, we have some interesting dynamics. I notice when the room is full, the audience online doesn't ask any question, but I still would like to invite those who attend online, if they have any question, to just raise their virtual hand. We monitor it. We have one more question from the audience here in the room. Yeah. Two even. Yeah.
Yes, hello, Christakis Georgiou. I'm a visiting fellow here at the RSC, originally at the University of Geneva. I had two comments on issues that have already been raised. The first one is about the theories and And you started off by saying that mainstream theories, correctly saying that mainstream theories ignore geopolitics. And I wanted to point out two things. First is that there is some realist theorizing of integration, and obviously they do take into account geopolitics. Now, the interesting point about that is that, and I'm referring to Joff, Mearsheimer, and Rosato's recent book from 2010. The interesting thing about those people is that they don't get published in the places where integration theorists tend to publish their work. They mostly publish in international security. In Joff's case, it was in foreign policy. It's very much two distinct debate venues. And I would say, so this is an invitation on you to reflect on this and to maybe say what kind of insights we can take from that. I think they're wrong, but that's not the main point here. And obviously, I was going to raise the state building literature and the Kellerman-McNamara paper as the way to go in terms of integrating geopolitics into theories of integration. Second point is about Riker, because he says that the collective good will arise from within the club or from within the states trying to aggregate into a federation. But you can say that in the case of the EU, the collective good is provided by the global hegemon, namely the United States, and it has been since the 1950s. And if the war in the Ukraine has done one thing, it is to reinvigorate American presence on the continent. So what does that say about European integration? Because it would seem to break the causal link that you have identified in terms of there's an external crisis, the club needs to get and actually one of the explanations for the lack of a European army or advances is the European pacifier, as Joff calls it in his famous paper from 1984. The fact that security is being taken care of by the hegemon, and so the members of the federation that is being built do not need to take care of that, and so they're not moving ahead.
Thanks. We move over there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis Russo. I'm a researcher here at SPS department of the UI. My point was just maybe in line with what was expected as a discussion. My intervention is probably unconsolidated thought more than a structured thing. Some interesting. This was extraordinarily interesting. One thing I found very interesting is that. In the survey and in survey in previous years, we see that every year there's been a reinforcing, there's been an increase in terms of EU attachment as political support for EU integration and for EU solidarity. Understood as redistribution within the EU, and we see this despite. Despite significant changes in European identity. So this raises the question: what is driving this political support for the EU? That in absence of an European demos, in absence of polity building, or there is polity building without identification. And this is very interesting and begs the question: what is behind this? And then we see that rising prices were that inflation and even in previous years, economic concerns have been prominent in terms of what drives, of what concerns citizens. And in a way, also the way in which the EU has responded to crisis has been a lot on the economic side. So we think we had the COVID crisis, and the EU had the Next Generation EU, greater steps into fiscal solidarity. So this begs the question: so if people are concerned about the economy, and the EU essentially delivers economic responses to shocks, is the EU maturing on the fly, maturing as a response of successive crises? And what does it say about the legitimacy of the EU in terms of economic output, and what is the role of economic output? And if so, if you would think of you know, the recent trends of political support, of attitudes towards the EU as a result of this crisis and the way in which the EU has led the crisis management, specifically, you know, on the economic side. Can inflation kind of take away, destroy is probably too strong of a word, but can inflation be a challenge to the kind of positive trend that we have seen in terms of political support for the EU? What is, in terms of kind of future, how is the inflation going to affect things in the future? Thank you, and sorry for the long question.
No worries. I think we'll have a final round of responses or comments from the panel, and then we slowly wrap up the session.
Okay. Very interesting questions. Thank you very much for that. The last two and those prior. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. My advice to Mearsheimer would be look inside countries as well as across them. And that, I think, partly explains the very poor predictions that he's made, particularly about European integration and the rise of Germany and the tensions between Germany and other countries that he predicted a time back. The interesting things about the predictions, one never goes back. You just move on to the next one. And I'd probably like to confront him with some of those prior ones. On Riker, that's very interesting. I mean, it is the United States that is the backdrop, which is very powerful for particularly countries in the East. But I want to draw your attention to three things. One, the overlap between the European Union and NATO has increased. That is, there are now, you know, two countries that are members of the EU that members of NATO that will become members of the EU, where that, you know, Sweden and Finland are now members of both, whereas they were members of one before. There are four EU countries that are not members of NATO, but two of them are island states, and the other two are Austria and Ireland, small countries. So there's a tremendous overlap between the two. That's observation one. Observation two is the European Union is playing a very large role in mobilizing resources for NATO by virtue of the intense coordination capacity within the European Union that is generally greater than across NATO countries. And three, the point about the United States being a backdrop is conditional, highly conditional on the US executive. And were Trump to be elected, and who knows what the future will hold, but were Trump to be elected, the European Union would loom even larger and greatly larger in terms of European security.
Just the one sentence to just emphasize that last point. It doesn't look good with respect to long-term prospects for, you know, a pro-European government in the United States. Trump has minimally a 50-50% chance to come into power, or someone like him. The Republican Party that we have today is not the Republican Party of the Bushes. If Mearsheimer makes the same prediction as me, I'll withdraw mine though.
I also thought the comments were very interesting. The EU provides a collective good, which is not military security, it's prosperity and peace. That's at least the prime values of the European Union. And the EU, I thought it was very interesting what you said, that the EU responds to the crisis with economic measures. The Next Generation EU Fund and the joint procurement of vaccination, these were the main responses to the COVID crisis. And you ask, can inflation be a challenge to the positive dynamic of the EU? And I would say it depends, because we so much stress the symmetry as a condition for the way a crisis works out. I would say it depends a lot how inflation will hit the different countries. If all the countries are hit in the same way, I think it will not be detrimental to the health of the European integration process. But imagine Southern Europe will be hit much harder than the frugal four. Then, of course, the frugal four have the intention to say, see, we said it all along, and they are incapable and incompetent and lazy and whatever. I think also the competence distribution is very important. And given that the EU has a lot of competence in fighting inflation, I think the prediction would be that this is not so problematic for EU integration as would be unemployment or something like that.
And perhaps to complement with an answer to the last question of how can we have polity building without identity building, and what would be then the basis for polity building if we see no difference in having stronger identities after the crisis. So I think one possible answer would be, again, in the line of symmetry, which would create a basis of bonding, which for us it's more solidarity that would create a permissive consensus. So in a way, we could also say that it's all quite expected for identities to be stable. Identities are slowly moving, whereas solidarity feelings, because of a symmetrical threat, those could create the basis for more polity building.
Okay, so there is always the question at the end of these sessions, the impact of the war in Ukraine on European integration or on Europe. Is this more Europe, less Europe, or same Europe?
In 2 words, more Europe. And you know, the support for Ukraine, the rebuilding of Ukraine is also going to take place through EU economic means, and it will also involve gifts as well as loans, and it will further lead, I mean, there are already plans on the table, and it will actually lead to a greater development of Eurobonds.
More Europe. We have studied the refugee crisis, and what happens now in terms of management of the refugee flows is just day and night compared to the refugee crisis. This temporary protection directive was really a burden sharing, solidary policy, which is indicative of more Europe. But also the idea of war is the driver of integration, of a federal bargain. I think that's very much present, and that's indicative of going further in the direction of integration.
Can I say you could believe a Brit and a Swiss on this topic?
I think that's a bit the consensus in the room. I don't know if everyone feels that this is not the case, if it's or if we agree this is the impact is more Europe. I guess.
Does anybody disagree? Is anyone brave enough to?
I think overall, yes, but it's interesting to compare the different types of crisis. The one when you were talking, actually, that came to my mind. It really meant now the economic measures after COVID, right? The economic measures was really kind of a enhancing of identification with Europe, clearly in Southern Europe, right? And more security, more weapons is costly, right? That all countries have to pay more, so the citizens have to pay more, and that actually is not solidarity. That means economically it's a burden, right? So it has the opposite effect, and how those two play together would be interesting to see in the data as well.
One more very brief point.
I mean, if I look at Europe, then Europe so blatantly fails in this crisis to do its best, that it must be a different Europe, which is not based on economic power, where political power is not based on economic power, but where different member states have kind of, you know, much more equal rights. I think of the Baltic states, for instance.
So we leave it at this, but I want to just very briefly, so thank you for your input and point to some connections. So we have a lot of connections with next week's session on security policy and European defense. So we slightly modified the session of next week. Stephanie Hoffman will take care of the input initially, together with Dietlind Stolle, who will also add some data on public opinion. I think that's an excellent combination. But also, I mean, we've seen data about inflation, which we discussed in the first session, and about energy supply, which we discussed last week. So I invite everyone who is interested in these topics and who did not attend the first two sessions to go on our website, because the sessions are recorded and you can watch them. But there are links to migration, obviously. We'll have a session in 3 weeks time, and on enlargement, which is the last session at the end of June. So I invite everyone to keep attending these sessions. So thank you very much again. Thank you also to the audience online. I hope to see you next week again. Goodbye.